Hello, I wanted to go over some Blender basics to help you get introduced to the program. These are the foundation of the tools you need to be able to navigate and use Blender, and I think if you practice these enough, you will basically be able to do anything you want in Blender. So first of all, if you hold your middle mouse button, you can rotate around your viewport. If you hold shift middle mouse button, you can pan. In this case, I've remapped mine to spacebar just so it's a little easier. If you use your left mouse button, you can click on any object. If you right click, it opens a context menu around whatever you selected. So in this case, you can see it says object here. And then I have some options like shade smooth, convert to, and whatnot. In order to translate or move objects, you can use G. By default, it does it based on the view plane. So you'll see if I start here, it's about right there. But if I move it like this, you can see it went along the plane. If you use Shift S, you can return your object to the world origin. So like, for example, selection to cursor. That brings us to the cursor. Shift S also has other options. So for example, if I move the object, I can do Shift S, cursor to selected, and it moves the cursor to whichever object I have selected. I can also use the same menu, Shift S, to move the cursor to the world origin. You can use R to rotate, and it will by default rotate around the camera axis, so you can see how it's rotating around the center of the camera view. You can also use X, Y, and Z in both move and rotate to rotate it or move it around those axes. You can use S to scale an object. You can also do that along each axis. You can always use escape to cancel an action that you're doing, and it will return back to its original place. You can use tab to go from object mode into edit mode, and vice versa. You can also change that just by going directly here, object mode, edit mode. You can swap between. And those are pretty much the basic controls. Now that you have those down, it will be much easier for you to navigate around the viewport. One thing I also would like to add is if you do Alt middle click, you can focus your view around whatever you click on. So like if I click down here, it'll center my view around that. This saves you from, for example, trying to get your viewport to exactly go around the object manually, or having your focus all the way out here and you're trying to like align it, but it's not really working, right? So that just helps with that. When you are in edit mode, you can use 1, 2, and 3 to change what type of selection mode you want. So 1 is just vertices, so I can select vertices. 2 allows me to select edges, and 3 allows me to select faces. All of your rotation and translation and scaling tools also work here. And now the rest of these controls that I'll talk about aren't really critical to the base functions of Blender, but they will become very useful once you start to get really into making your own objects and everything else. One of the most critical ones is the loop tool. If you do Control R, you can add an edge loop, and you can use your scroll wheel to change the number of loops. So for example, I can click to apply. After you click, it'll go like this, which allows you to slide them. If you just press escape, it will go back to whatever the default original location was. So I can do this a few more times and make a cube like this. So now I have like a subdivided cube, kind of. If you Alt click, you can select an edge loop. If you hold Shift while doing this, you can select multiple edge loops. If you select an edge loop and then do Control X, you can dissolve that edge loop. For example, you might want to do this if you're trying to optimize a model. So like in this example, if I'm selecting every other one pretty much, let me actually go back and fix these. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? And now I press Control X. Now it's more optimized. I'm going to undo with Control Z. And then I want to show you another feature. If I go into vertex selection and I go up here to this button, it's called proportional editing. You can also press O to turn it on and off. Proportional editing lets you influence other vertices or edges and whatnot based upon your original selection. So for example, if I try to translate this, you can see that the proportional editing is allowing me to influence all of the other vertices as well. You can also see there's different smoothing curves on this. The default is smooth, and you can see how it's like kind of, starts slow, goes up, and smooths out, right? If I only translate on the x-axis, you can exactly see this. So you can see here, it's the same thing. And then based upon the distance of the other vertices, it kind of smooths that out. So you can see it kind of bunches up here and stretches out here, but it's all pretty much even and smooth. Then if I were to change it to sphere, you can see it acts in a sphere. I can also use my scroll wheel to adjust how much the influence is. If I do root, has that shape, and then all the other ones are pretty similar, sharp, and so on. The next critical feature is going to be the magnet tool. It's snap, that's what it's called. You could use Shift-Tab to open this or turn it on. By default, we'll use increment, which means it's going to go against the grid, like this. You can use Shift to make the grid more granular, and then you can use Control to just avoid the grid entirely. But also, you have other ones, such as vertex, so it'll snap to other vertices. You have edge, so you can snap it along an edge, and you can see it has that little hourglass icon to show it's doing that. And then there's also face. Face is nice. It just does it against whatever face it sees. This is good if you're like placing furniture, for example. It also does it against volume. I've never actually used this one really, but I'm sure you could find a use for it. And then there's all these other ones. What you can also do, so for example, if I use Shift-D to duplicate my cube, which actually, once I duplicate it, I'm automatically in translation. So once I duplicate it, I can actually just press like an axis and move along the axis. If I do edge again, and then I had the snapping on, and I move this here, you'll see it's snapping against all of the edges of that. If I go over here and I turn on my wireframe, we can see the wireframe. I'll actually turn that down a little bit just so it's not as obvious. But you can see now it's snapping to each edge based on the closest, because it's currently selected on closest, the closest point on the object. Now, I'm going to go over the pivot points real quick. Pivot points, bounding box center. If I go here on the Object Properties tab and go to Object, I can go to Viewport Display and I can turn on Bounding Box. You might not see anything right now, but if I do, in fact, modify this mesh using our tools from earlier, you can see that there's a bounding box around the object because that's its max. This bounding box actually changes based on what you have selected. It doesn't show it here, but because I have both items selected, it creates a bounding box around both. So if I rotate, it will rotate around the center of the bounding box of those objects. If I do 3D cursor, it will rotate around the cursor on the screen right there. If I do individual origins, it will rotate each or move each object based on its origin. Median point is similar to bounding box, but I believe it's based around the origin point, so it will get the median of that. And then there's active element. You can probably see how this is like a yellow color, and then this one is like an orange color. The yellow color is the active element. So if I were to duplicate this a couple more times, like this, and then select all of them, you can see that this one is now active, and it will rotate around that one. If I hold Shift, I can keep all of them selected, but I can switch which one is active, and I can rotate around that one. As you might have guessed, just to show it off, if I change it to 3D cursor, my pivot point, I can use Shift right-click to change my cursor location. And if I go into edit mode with this object, and I go select edge loops, and I select that edge loop, and it's rotating around that, and I have proportional editing on, I can do something kind of weird. It kind of does that. Let me do it on the top. So you might notice it when I try to select edge loop, doesn't work because this is not technically an edge loop because it comes to a point. There's only 3 poles on this, or it's a 3 pole. There's only 3 edges on it. I'll select using shift all the edges, and then if I were to rotate, I'll change the cursor to be right here. Let's say if I do this now, then it kind of does this, and this is kind of cool. It's fun, and I can change the influence, right? So now we have this cool little thing. And you can see, actually, it's interesting. Because I didn't select all of the top, the center kind of caves in, which I think is actually quite interesting. These are pretty much all of the basics that you need to kind of move around Blender. There's a bunch of other features, but for the most part, I think this should get you close enough. You can see, like, we already created a pretty complex object just by using these basic features. And if I really wanted to, I can go to the modifiers tab and do, like, subdivision surface modifier, and it kind of looks cool. Like if I turn off the wireframe, shade smooth, and just increase that a little more, like that's kind of cool, isn't it? Anyways, I hope this video helped. Feel free to like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.